Right, and good evening and hello to everyone who has joined the webinar live today or is watching this as a recording. I know loads of you are watching this as a recording, so hello. So for anyone who has joined live, just before we get into it, just to let you know there is the chat function where you can chat about the webinar, but there's also the Q&A function where you can go there, answer questions. They come up on my screen. And throughout the webinar, I'll be going for those. We are also going to have plenty of opportunities throughout the webinar and at the end to answer any questions. That's a really crucial part of these kind of webinars. So if you've got a question, feel free to note it down, put it in the chat, write it on a piece of paper in front of you, and we will have plenty of opportunities. So this webinar is an introduction to cognitive science via Tutorful and being hosted by myself, Arthur Moore. Just a little bit about me for just before we kick off. So I am an online maths tutor. That is my day-to-day job. I was a trained secondary maths teacher teaching in the UK and internationally. I've taught in a variety of schools. I've taught in international schools, boarding schools, state schools, outstanding schools, schools that Ofsted would say requires improvement. I've taught to in a whole host of schools. I also am the founder of Navigated Tutor and More Edu. More Edu is my tutoring business, and Navigated Tutor is my platform for training tutors and providing CPD to the tutoring sector. I, in 2024, was lucky enough to be the winner of the National Tutor of the Year from the Tutors Association. And my platform of Navigated Tutor has been shortlisted for multiple awards in multiple years. And this year was shortlisted for 2 awards for providing CPD to tutors. So that's a little bit about me. Maths is my background, but very much this webinar today and our webinars, a part of these series, are not maths focused. They are focused no matter what your subject, no matter what your age group, no matter where you do group one-to-one, however you work as a tutor with Tutorful. So let's kick off. So our aims for this session today. Understand the goal of using cognitive science in our tutoring. Define some of the key terminology that makes a real benefit to us throughout our kind of journey into cognitive science to really understand what we mean by the terminology. And also to increase our own understanding of learning happens. And obviously that is super important when working with our students. So all of this is designed with the student in mind. How can we as tutors have a greater impact with our students? So I want to talk about this term of cognitive science, because sometimes it gets thrown around, it gets used in blogs, in books, in podcasts. Sometimes we don't really take a moment to really talk about what we actually mean by the term. So cognitive science is the study of cognition, which is a term for all the forms we use for knowing and awareness. So it's the study of knowing and awareness. So that's what we mean by cognitive science. And then obviously we are using that in our tutoring perspective as teachers. So it's quite a young discipline. Psychology is a very young discipline. It started back in like the 1890s with psychologists and scientists beginning to do research over what we would call mental processes, i.e. what's happening in the brain, and trying to outline what was going on. For example, like if we have a pain in our body, we want to know kind of what's the process for actually feeling that pain as part of the industry. Then in the 1910s, psychological researchers and scientists started to hypothesize that we learn behaviors through interaction with the environment. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. And that's a process known as conditioning. And that might be a phrase you know with kind of Pavlov's dog or other forms of conditioning us to do something. By the time we get to the 1950s, the scientists have emphasized the idea that the human mind is more complex than we originally thought. And it does more than just responding to the environment. So originally it was just, here's the environment we're in, our brain responds. And they realize there's more of that. There's more a mechanism underlying all these kind of mental processes. And they were aiming to try and explain how it worked. For example, they might say that our what we call our observable behaviors, such as speaking and our facial expressions, and cognitive science was trying to explain the unobservable behaviors, such as our own thinking processes and our emotions. So that's kind of where all this kind of comes about. And the whole aim is cognitive science is aimed to explain these mental processes, what is going on in the brain, and allowing us to understand the mind. And obviously, when we are working with our students, what they are thinking is really, really important. So that's where cognitive science comes in. It's a way of allowing us to understand what is going on. And that process of allowing us to understand what our students are learning allows us to apply the principles of cognitive science to our teaching to help teach our students more efficiently and effectively. And that's a really key phrase. This is not talking about trying to teach our students in a cognitive science way for the sake of it, just to try and appear clever and means we get to use loads of cool processes. What it's about is actually how can we do this thing that we call learning in an efficient and effective way. And I think we can all kind of talk about that as tutors. We want to be effective. Of course, we want to be effective with our teaching and with our students learning, but we also need to be efficient. We can't spend 14 years just doing what 1 + 1 is. That doesn't really work. We need to have some kind of efficiency. So when we're talking about efficiency, we're not talking about that in a negative aspect. We're not saying efficiency is sometimes we align with kind of businesses, be a more efficient, cut things. What we're saying is, how can we really talk to the brain and get that learning happening as clear and concisely as possible? Does anyone have any questions? Kind of give me a really brief summary of cognitive science there. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A section. I will keep coming back and talk about. There were a couple of questions, but I've kind of answered those when we were talking about kind of what we mean by cognitive science. And also someone was saying about this a word, kind of what do we mean by efficiency? What it means, we're trying to get the brain to work in as positive and as best way as possible. And that allows more learning essentially to happen, which is really what we kind of want to happen. Next, I want to talk about some of the key words that we need to know with cognitive science. And that's going to be really important throughout this series of webinars. So these are really important. There's a couple of tasks in here for us to do and a couple of thought points. So if you've got a notebook or some place where you can make notes, that would be absolutely fantastic. So the first thing I want to talk about, and maybe the most crucial thing I'm going to talk about in any of my webinars here, is this idea of working memory. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the term before, or if this is a new term for us. So what we mean by working memory, it is the area of the brain responsible for short-term information storage, manipulation, and processing. I essentially like to think about it as what we are thinking about right now. What is in your thought process at this exact moment is your working memory. And I like to refer to it as kind of the post-it note of the brain. When I write something down on the post-it note, it's what I'm thinking of at that exact moment. I'm going to lose that post-it note. It's going to be thrown away. It's not something I now know forever. But it's what I was thinking at that moment. Now, a post-it note is brilliant. I can get information onto there. But a post-it note, like working memory, does have some limitations. And we need to be aware of those limitations because this is what our student is doing as we are delivering content to them, as we are teaching them. So, two things I really want to emphasize about working memory. It has a very limited capacity. Research suggests that it's between 5 and 9 bits of information at any point. Now, what I mean by bits of information will be different to each of us. It's not just 9 different bits of information. So, for example, I've got a son who's 5 years old. When I teach him a new word, a really long word that he needs to break down, for example, maybe he's learning the word onomatopoeia or alliteration. I'm going to break that word down into sections. Now, for me, the word onomatopoeia is 1 bit of information. I know that word. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to break it down into any more things. It's a word that I know. But for him, it might be several, 2 or 3 bits of information. Onomatopoeia. It might even be more than that. So it's a different bit of information for each of us. My younger daughter is just learning to spell her name. Her name is Bonnie. Now, for her, when she's trying to spell Bonnie, it takes up the complete all of her concentration to think of the B, the O, then 2 N's, then the I and E. But for me, Bonnie is a very small bit of information in my working memory. It barely takes up any space. For her, it takes up everything. And that is going to be true for our students.
Look, when dinner is ready, I'm going to sit down and I will.
Just going to mute someone there. Apologies.
No, you gotta laugh.
There we go. So think about it as like a shopping list. So, for example, if I asked you to go down to the shops right now and buy 2 or 3, 4, 5, whatever bits of information, you'd probably be fine. You'd make it to the shop, you'd remember those 3 or 4 things, you'd buy them, you'd come home. That's fine. But if I gave you 7 or 8 or 15 or 20, and I didn't give you any other information, I didn't break it down or anything like that, you're almost definitely going to forget something by the time you get to the shop. And that's exactly what working memory is like. It's very, very limited. It's this idea of a post-it note. That's how I like to think about it. And I just want to demonstrate something with working memory. So here's 4 words on the board. 4 words. I'd like to try and remember those words. And now I'd like you to try and remember those words. You can either write it down on a piece of paper, say it out loud if you're muted, put it in the chat. See if you can remember those 4 words. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask for a bit of interaction. So please get ready. If you can use the chat function, that would be brilliant. Those are those 4 words. Can you, if possible, just put in the chat how many you got correct? How many of those 4 words could you remember? Good. Lots of full marks coming in. Full marks. 4s, 4s, 4s. All the words. Excellent. Brilliant. There we go. We've remembered all the words. Again, 4 more words there. 4 more words there. You're not writing them down. You're just trying to look at them, try and memorize them. There we go. Now let's see if you can replicate. Can you write down those 4 words? Can you remember those 4 words? And there they are. And again, I just wanted to give yourself a score. Let's do some grading. Let's mark ourselves. A bit of formative assessment here. And just let me know again. So there's good, as I expecting. Good, some well done. Philip getting 4. Gladys 3. No, I got 3 when I first did these kind of 4 words, Gladys. So that really speaks to me. Good. So, okay. So good. We're seeing a mixture here. We've gone from all definitely getting all 4s. Now we're kind of getting a bit of a mixture of scores. Really interesting. Right. There's 4 more words. Right, and now would like to try and remember those 4 words. And there they are. And again, I'd just like to score yourself and put your scores in the chat, please. Thank you. So again, we've now got a real mixture of scores. So if we look at all the 3 sections there, now the first group of 4 words there, I expected most of us to get all 4 of those right, because they're words that we kind of align with. Like I remember kind of student teach, student learn, they all kind of integrate, they're all kind of similar words to me. So I can bring those together quite easily in my working memory. The second one is a little harder. We've got ing, we've got plurals, we've got post tense. So it's quite easy to make a mistake there. Now the third section here. Now it's interesting. Someone said in the chat they got 4 because used the word mathematical. I'm assuming some of you who have got 4 teach maths and A-level maths. If you can give me a thumbs up in the chat, that would be amazing, or anything like that. That'd be brilliant. Now, for me, I can remember these words quite easily because I teach implicit differentiation and I teach parametric integration. I teach them quite often. So for me, those last 4 words, they're not really 4 separate bits of information. They're kind of 2, maybe even 1 bit of integration, because they come from my knowledge of A-level maths. And what's interesting, a couple of people got 4 out of 4 have said, yep, I teach A-level maths, I teach maths. So we can see that thing. Whereas if you had put 4 words up there to do with teaching A-level German, I'm probably really going to struggle to get those. And I imagine some of you who didn't get 4 out of 4 in that last section there, maybe don't teach maths because you are making 4 separate bits of information in your brain, which is much harder to remember. Much harder to remember. And that's just a small example of working memory here. Each of those tasks were the same. Remember 4 words. But as a group, we scored differently on them. And we scored differently because of the mental processes going on behind what I can see, behind kind of the visual I can see or the chat function or anything like that. And that's what makes this a little bit different. That's what makes this different here. So this is this idea of working memory really does kind of have an impact upon how I work. So there's just a little example there. Any questions on my points? Does anyone have any questions about working memory or want to share kind of a thought about it? Again, feel free to put it in the chat. If you don't want other people to see, you can either message it to me directly or you can put it in the Q&A function, which is there. It should be on your Zoom. And then just I can answer those. So just someone asked, just a reminder, working memory. We think it's between 4 and 9. Like research is obviously, it's a very hard thing to research, but research would suggest that anything over kind of soon we get into double figures just is really hard for our brain to conceptually think of. And if you think about it intuitively, if I ask you to think about kind of 5 or 6 completely separate notions, really difficult, really difficult. Whereas if I give you 2 or 3, you can normally hold on to those. Think about it as a to-do list. Why would I write a to-do list if I could remember the 15 things I have to do? Right, the next one is long-term memory. So we're moving from working memory now into long-term memory. Now, long-term memory, I like to think as the wardrobe of the mind, because it's where we store our information. Like if you go to the wardrobe, you open it up, there's everything you own, probably clothes-wise. And it has a huge capacity. It's that never-ending wardrobe. So long-term memory is not this thing that is limited in the same way that working memory is. We really think it kind of essentially has an unlimited capacity. You can keep bringing more things into your learning memory. Now, this is crucial here. We define learning as taking place when information is transferred from our working memory to our long-term memory. I'm going to go to this in even more detail in a bit, once we've kind of gone over a couple of other terms. But for now, I just want you to remember that if we just have something in our working memory, so if I say to a student, here's a picture of a trapezium, I'm teaching them trapeziums, and they see a picture of a trapezium, they have that in their working memory, then I take that picture away and 30 seconds later, they've forgotten that. Learning hasn't happened because that information wasn't transferred from the thing we're thinking of, our post-it note, to our wardrobe. So that means learning hasn't happened. That's a really key bit. We're going to go over to that even more in a bit. And I think this is really important because critically, just because we are exposing our students to new material does not mean it has been remembered or learnt. We have to actively process something in our long-term memory. So what I mean by this is fundamentally our working memory is just something at a given moment. It is not an indication that something has been learnt. So just because you remember those 4 words that I put up does not mean you have now learnt those 4 words. It's just something you were able to hold in that point. Whereas if you're able to keep bringing those back from long-term memory, then that's more an indication that something has been learnt. And this idea of long-term memory, and I think about this as kind of the wardrobe again, is there's different parts of our long-term memory. There's different ways we can store things. So there's a graph here talking along the y-axis going up, the storage strength, how well something has been stored. And then on the bottom says something called retrieval strength. Now, retrieval is your ability to go and find that bit of information. So for example, using the wardrobe as an analogy, if I asked you where your jeans are, well, you probably know exactly where they are in your wardrobe. You're able to retrieve that bit of information and it's going to stay there for quite a long time. Whereas if I asked you for that thing you wore to that wedding a couple of years ago, well, it is in the wardrobe. It's probably there, but it might take you a bit of time to remember it because it probably wasn't stored. When you put it away, you probably went, it's gone now. I don't need to think about it. If we think about this away from kind of the wardrobe analogy, so something that has a really good retrieval strength and storage strength would be, for example, your email address. It's something you are using all the time, remembering, and therefore it's stored really, really well. You don't have to wake up every morning and say, what is my email address? I'm just going to remind myself it's kind of there, especially if this is an email address. I'm talking about an email address you've been using for quite a long time. Something that has a low retrieval and low storage would be something like how many things can the working memory hold? Because for some of you, that would just be brand new information you've just had. It probably hasn't had the time to really been stored really strongly, and you haven't had time to remember it. So it's in the long-term memory, hopefully, but maybe it hasn't been stored very well. It makes it quite difficult to remember if I asked you tomorrow, for example. Now, something that has a high retrieval strength but low storage would be like your hotel when you go on holiday. When you're on holiday, you know the name of your hotel. You know the name of your hotel because you probably used it to get onto the bus or get a taxi, or when you were walking around, you say, I need to go back to this hotel. It's everywhere. But kind of as soon as you come back from holiday 2 or 3 weeks later and I ask you the name of the hotel you stayed at, you might not remember. I was on holiday about a month ago. I cannot remember the name of the hotel. I have absolutely no idea. But at that moment, I was able to retrieve it. So it's there. I just can't quite store it. It might be that thing. If someone told me or gave me a hint, bang, I've got it. But it's not stored really well. And then another example would be kind of like your current phone number or your PIN code, for example. It's something that you store a lot, but sometimes it's quite hard to do. So a phone number is a good example of this. It is there, your storage strength, but at the moment, we don't always use our phone numbers. Like sometimes if someone asks you your mobile address, I find it really tricky to remember. If you ask me my wife's email address, it is there, but it takes a bit of time. Whereas if you ask me for my home phone number when I was growing up, I could tell you that straight away because I was using that all the time. It was really well stored. I was retrieving it all the time. So I just wanted to show you here, this is kind of long-term memory has different areas within it. And we need to be mindful of that with our students. So has anyone got any questions there? So we've spoke about working memory and long-term memory and kind of the roles between the two. I'm going to talk about a couple more ideas, and then I'm going to talk about how this all comes together in the process of learning, which we need to be really mindful of our students. Just a reminder, what we're doing here is we're going over these key bits of terminology in order for when we go deeper into this idea of cognitive science, we've understood what we mean by these terms. It can be really tricky if we haven't clearly defined these. So next, I want to talk about cognitive load theory. Now, just as a quick example, in the chat, can you give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, a yes, no, if you've heard of the phrase cognitive load theory? Literally a thumbs up or thumbs down is absolutely fine. Okay. Okay, really useful to know. So we've talked a bit about oh, someone's just said they did their PhD in cognitive psychology. So if you need to take over the webinar, please let me know. Or if you need to correct me on anything, please shout out. So we've talked a bit about cognition and cognitive. So that word we kind of would understand. And load, we kind of understand that word separately. It's a burden upon us. So cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory really emphasizes the difference between the working and the long-term memory. And this is how I like to think of cognitive theory, cognitive load theory. It's the funnel of the mind. So above the funnel here, where all those little dots and balls are falling into, that's the thing coming from our long-term memory. That's our long-term memory, and it's trying to go into the thing we're thinking of. And what cognitive load theory does is it states that processing too much information at once can lead to overload in the working memory. And then this overload slows down and hinders the overall learning process and has a negative impact on bringing that information into our working memory. So, for example, if I asked you to think of your mum or dad or an adult in your house where you grew up, their birthday, probably a date's coming to mind. Hopefully a date's coming to mind. Or if you want to think about anyone's birthday, for example. If I asked you to think of everyone in your family, kind of their birthdays, and bring those all to mind right now, I'm starting to find that a bit trickier. And as if I asked you to bring out every birthday you know for all your close friends and things like that. And also I want to know what you had for dinner and breakfast and what your plans for tomorrow are. I kind of what you'll start to find is you can't think of anything. And that's because we're trying to do too much. Now, what this theory, it isn't just about helping our students to remember more. What it's about is us being very mindful that our mental processes that our students are going through have limits. There is a limitation to what they can literally be thinking of. And we need to avoid this thing called cognitive load theory in order to be more focused with our approaches to learning. You've probably seen this with your students. So I just want you to take a moment to reflect this. Have you ever had a moment with a student where you've given them some information and then you've asked them in some way to use that bit of information and they have been able to do absolutely nothing with it? They haven't been able to do anything with it. I just want to take a moment to reflect upon a time, preferably recently, where you've been working with a student, you've delivered some new content, and then when you've asked for that content to come back from them, they've really struggled to do anything. And what's probably happened there is you, and I know I've done this as a tutor loads, probably hundreds of times, is I'm trying to put too many resources into their working memory. And some of the information I've been giving them is irrelevant or not really focused. And that's depleting from their long-term memory. sorry, from their cognitive load. For example, if you're sitting in your office, in your workspace, maybe you've got headphones on and you're just focusing on the screen, hopefully of what I'm saying, you're kind of engaging with, you're listening with. Whereas if you're watching this webinar, but you're kind of doing your emails on the side, the dog's running around, someone's playing music in the other room, and I'm also trying to write a to-do list for tomorrow, then what really happens is I don't really do any of those things well. I don't really do my emails. I kind of listen to the music in the background. My to-do list is incomplete. The dog is kind of using up some of my attention, but I don't really know what the dog wants or anything like that. And what's happening here is I'm just putting too much emphasis on my own brain. There's only a limit to what it can do. Now, this isn't saying that my brain isn't working properly or I don't have intelligence, would be the kind of the classic mantra here. It's just saying that I'm overloading it and therefore it's not working in an efficient way. And we talked about that word earlier. And this is something you've probably noticed a lot with your students. If you do a session that has loads and loads of stuff in it, it's almost too much. Whereas if you focus on 2 or 3 things and you do them really, really well, the student really engages, you get fantastic answers. So Eva, please ask me a question at this stage. I'm going to leave stages at the end for a proper little Q&A and little chat with me if anyone would like. But what I want you thinking of is what that has implications of for your tutoring. So what we've spoke about so far is working memory, the thing we're thinking of right now. Our long-term memory, where information gets stored, and cognitive load, which is how many things we're trying to get our students to remember and bring into their working memory. And just have a little moment to reflect upon what that means for your student. Your student's in a session with you. They've got a lot going on. They're probably thinking about some of the stuff that's happened in school today. They might have a TV show they want to watch on Netflix later. Their phone might be on the table buzzing. That's already a lot of information on their brain, and you're trying to put even more information on there. And we need to be conscious of that with our students. So now we can talk a little bit about what actually happens when your student is learning. So this is going to be a kind of a really concise idea of what happens when we are delivering new content to our student, to the students we're working with. And it all comes down to this classic image here. So I'm just going to give everyone a few moments to really look at that image, to read it through. It's an image that Tom Sherrington uses a lot from Ollie Cav, who it was created by. I'm just going to give everyone a minute just to really take a moment to look at that diagram there. And then we're going to talk about it in some more detail. Okay. Don't worry, I'm going to leave the image on the screen for quite a bit of time. We're going to talk about this in different ways. So as I said, this is not the complete model of learning by any means at all. But it's a really useful image for us thinking about what is happening with our student here during our session. So firstly, we've got the environment in which they are residing. So they've got billions of bits of information being thrown at them at any moment. If you take a moment to just sit where you are, think about how many bits of information there are in your environment. It's an enormous amount, from colors to now I've got my calendar up there, which has all my numbers on. I've got my whiteboard up there. I've got water bottle. I've got my plants and stuff like that. So there's a lot going on. Now we bring our student attention to just one bit of that environment, a bit of information. that we want them to focus on. And as the tutor, we are getting them to focus on a specific bit of information on their environment that we want them to think hard about. And that's where their attention is. And we manage to get that attention on that bit of information. And that means our student is now using their working memory to think about that single bit of information that we drew their attention to. So, for example, a couple of evenings ago, I was teaching Pythagoras. So we were teaching about that. There will be plenty of examples in all your subject areas. So I brought my students' attention to a very specific thing, and that is now in their working memory. Preferably because I know the working memory can be overloaded really easy and is really finite in how many bits of information it has. I don't want to put too much in there. There's no point me trying to give them 6, 7 new definitions at once and trying to get them to focus on that. So that's where their working memory is focused on. Now, if they learn the thing we are talking about, and over our sessions, we're going to talk a lot more about that kind of word, then what happens is the information that was in their working memory has been moved to their long-term memory. It has been put in their wardrobe of knowledge. It is now there. Now, later on in the session, or in a different session, we try to get our student to remember that bit of information. So what they need to do is they need to go to their long-term memory and remember it and bring it to their working memory. So we're going to do a little example of this. So in the chat, I would like to try and put the first 4 words that I asked you to memorize. The first 4 words. Try and do it without looking at your piece of paper if you wrote them down or anything like that. Try and remember them. And then put them in the chat if you can. Excellent. So a lot of us are able to bring those 4 words back to us. And that's because it was quite recent. Its retrieval strength is still quite high. Now, if I asked you to do that in a week's time, would you get 4 out of 4? If I asked you in a month's time, would you get 4 out of 4? If I came back in a year's time and said that, would you remember that? And that's the classic thing with our students, isn't it? Who has said at any point during one of their tutoring sessions, we went over this last week, why can't you remember it? We did this last week. Come on, guys, let's remember it. We've all said that, or at least I've said it plenty of times. And that's because just because they're remembering something, what happens if it gets forgotten? We've got that down here. What happens if it gets forgotten? And it's that idea here that once working memory knowledge goes into our long-term memory, we can either remember it or we can forget it. And what a lot about teaching becomes is how can we help our students to remember things rather than forgetting things? And what you'll notice about forgetting here is it can come from working memory or our long-term memory. So just because this bit of information that I've drawn their attention to has gone into the working memory is not a guarantee in any form that they will remember it. It's not even a guarantee that it will get close to their long-term memory, which means it's being processed in a different way by the brain. And that's a really crucial thing for us as educators to know. And I would argue in our role as tutors, it's even more important because I would say it'd be great for you to put in the chat. How often do you see the students you work with? I imagine it's normally once a week. For most of us, it would be once a week. And that means we are putting an awful lot of emphasis on our student to be able to remember something that we put into their working memory. And all this is even precedented on us making sure that the working memory is focused on the one bit of information we wanted them to think on. If their attention is on a different area, then the bit of information I may have been getting them to think about may have not even made it to the working memory. One of the key takeaways I want you to take away from this session is that working memory has a limited capacity. But if at the moment I said that, your phone buzzed, or you looked out the window, or someone shouted for your attention, then I don't know for certain that that's where your attention was. And I would say that line there is really crucial for us as tutors. Are we drawing our students' attention to the information we want them to? Because their working memory can only focus on so many things. Does anyone have any questions there about the mental model I showed there? I'll put it back up on the screen if anyone has any questions. I think this is a really fantastic diagram for us really being able to understand what is going on. And even at this level, this understanding really can make a really big difference to you as a tutor. I remember the first time someone was talking to me about working memory, it really made a difference. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my reflections, and then I'm going to get you to reflect upon this as well. So cognitive science, when I first started teaching, there was a little bit, we mentioned this a little bit, but it was focused a lot on the content I was delivering. That's a lot when I was training as a teacher, that's where a lot of the focus was, the content. There was not so much on actually how my students were learning. And over my period of time as a teacher and as a tutor, I've realized that I need to put more emphasis on how my student is learning, because I can be saying brilliant things, but if my student is not engaging with that cognitively, then all the brilliant things that I've said are just going to get lost in the ether. And that's for me why cognitive science is really important. I don't design absolutely everything I do purely from research and academic science. Absolutely not. I use cognitive science to help me become a better educator. And that's kind of my reflections. So what I want you to do is just do a similar question towards yourself. So either asking yourself how much emphasis you put on cognitive science at the moment into your tutoring, when you last did a bit of CPD, as you're doing tonight, on cognitive science, or if you have done some, I'd be really interested in some of your thoughts as you kind of commented, the impact that this has had. So if you wanted to put it in the chat, that would be absolutely fantastic. If you don't want to, you just want to write it down or just think about it privately, that's also absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. Someone's just put a really key point about kind of long-term memory, and I'm going to go into this in kind of in more detail in later webinars. The idea that they don't decay, we just kind of lose the ability to retrieve them would be my kind of way of putting it. So my old address from when I was at uni, it's there somewhere, but I just haven't got the ability to retrieve it. If someone wrote down the first bit of a word or gave me kind of a missing letter activity in it, I would probably be able to retrieve it. And that's telling me that I'm not able, I haven't essentially, that knowledge hasn't gone. I'm just not able to retrieve it in any way. And what we were talking about there with kind of cognitive overload is absolutely crucial with all this. If I try and ask myself to remember too much, I'm not going to remember anything. So hopefully that's giving you some time to kind of reflect upon kind of some of your uses of cognitive science. I think it's a brilliant way to make us all better educators. And that's kind of what this is all about. The one thing that kind of links us all on this webinar, whether you're watching it live or whether you're watching as a recording or whether you're re-watching it 6 months later, is we all want to do the best by our students. And cognitive science, I find, makes me a better, more efficient, more effective educator. Yes, Gladys, you're absolutely right. Someone's just said this has really emphasized them that revisiting learned topics is important. Absolutely bang on. We're going to talk about this even more in kind of later webinars over the summer. So the key takeaways I wanted everyone to kind of leave with is working memory is limited and should not be overloaded. And just because something has been seen doesn't mean that it has been learnt. And I think those two things are absolutely crucial for us as tutors, especially when you're working with your students via Tutorful. These students who you've got and you kind of only see them once a week, we need to be really effective with that time. And just because we put something on the board doesn't mean it has been learnt. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that you can do outside of this webinar to kind of this issue. And then I'm going to open the floor up to any questions, any specific questions about any tutoring and stuff like that. So I have a couple of freebies that are open to everyone on this call. So if you want to join, if you're on WhatsApp and you want to join a group that has once a week, myself or another educator called Andrew Gadsby posting a little 2-3 minute video about things that you can do to develop yourself as a tutor. It's completely free and it's just a little video that we share once a week. There'll be a video out today or tomorrow or Wednesday, Thursday. Then you can join that on WhatsApp really easily. I will put this QR code up again in a moment. It's completely free. There's absolutely no fee for that at all. And it's not a chatting WhatsApp group. The only notifications you're going to get are from us posting those videos. Basically, we shut down the chat so no one else can engage. That's completely free. There's also a tutoring podcast I have out called Tutoring Tips. And what I've done there is I've got 50 tutors from around the world to share their top tips as a tutor. That podcast is literally 2.5 minutes long in their episodes. And you've got, I think it's 49 episodes where tutors from around the world have shared a top tip for tutors. There's loads of really great free information there from people who are in our industry who have done this over a number of years. Now, I do have a paid platform. I'm not going to mention this too much, but if you want to find out more, there's a QR code there. My paid platform is Navigator Tutor, where we have ongoing pedagogical development as tutors. And that's how you can connect with me. The best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So the WhatsApp group is bottom left. The podcast is top left. And myself on LinkedIn, which is the best place that you're going to find me, is top right. I write a series of newsletters on there. I write about tutoring. I write about a whole host of ideas, and all with the idea of kind of how can we develop ourselves as tutors. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar there. And what I'm going to do for the last part of this, if you want to go, you absolutely can do. Feel free. But I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that anyone has. Feel free to, you can either type them in the chat. You can unmute yourself if you want to ask me a question. It might be a question about cognitive science. It might be a question about what this means for tutoring in your subject. It might be you've got a session tomorrow and you want to bring some aspects of this into that session. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have, or at least try and answer some of them. But if anyone has any questions, please just put it in the Q&A, put it in the chat, let me know, and more than happy to discuss them. But my key takeaways from this webinar on an introduction into cognitive science is working memory is limited and should not be overloaded. And just because something has been seen doesn't mean that it has been learned. It's been awesome having so many of you join us this evening. Thank you to everyone who watched it as a recording. And I'll stick around for any questions if anyone has them. Someone's just asked me to reshare. There it is. Someone's just asking for that to be shared. Okay, someone was just asking a question about what can I do to make sure working memory isn't overloaded. It's a really good question to ask yourself as an educator. The number one thing I would be thinking of is how can I reduce distractions to what I want my student to be focusing on. So, for example, if I've got a slide on the board and I've got loads of pictures going on, animations, GIFs, I'm trying to engage them, and the bit of information is also on there, it's very, very hard for me to draw attention to that for my student. There's just too much going on. So that's the number one thing I would be doing in that situation is I'd be trying to limit the other things that could overload. And I would also be asking myself, in this moment, really, what do I want my student to be focusing on? So even if I'm doing something like a written activity in English, and if I really want them thinking about the introduction, well, let's really put the focus on that. Let's not have a board full of what an introduction is, the middle bit, the conclusion, all that stuff is. Let's just go in on information. If I like, you can think about this if you're a music tutor, for example. If there's one specific bit that your student is struggling to play, you don't so play me the whole piece with the whole band. We come more focused in and say, well, actually, how can we focus on this specific area? So someone's just asked me a question specifically about something called mirror neutrons. So I won't be not as specific as that in the webinars. What the next series of webinars are going to be is on aspects of teaching that we can focus on. So questioning, distributed learning theory, meaningfulness, different ideas that we can bring into our tutoring. But we are going to be talking about, you spoke about when we do something and different ways that we can kind of observe other people doing something. And we're going to be talking about the kind of the importance of self-talk and stuff like that. So there's not going to be a slide that says mirror neurons, but we will be talking about the importance of explaining, which I think is one of the things you're talking about. Show, don't tell is a really important when we're talking about kind of metacognitive self-talk, which is a really interesting part of this. I hope that answers your question. Someone in the Q&A section has just asked kind of about long-term memory, accessing long-term memory. So what we can often think about, and I'll go into these in more detail in other things, is often when something goes into our long-term memory, it is associated with a specific context or what we might call a cue, CUE. So, for example, when I'm teaching something to do with fractions, I may specifically taught it with all the numerators being the number 3. So what happened is my student has associated fractions with the denominator, the bottom number, being the number 3. So when I show them a fraction where the denominator is a 5, they don't make that association. And therefore, the working memory doesn't go to that part of long-term memory. For example, it'd be essentially going to the wrong part of the wardrobe. Like you're looking for something, you know it's there, but I put it in one cupboard and you're only looking at this cupboard here. Makes it very hard for you to find the thing that you're trying to find. So that's one thing I would be thinking about is when you taught it, was it linked to a specific context? So if I was doing a writing piece in English and I was trying to get them to do a skill, but I taught them this skill when we were doing an analysis of a poem, I may start off by doing it as a poem and trying to get them to make their connection and then talking about how the connection isn't just associated with poems. And then the proactive way of doing this is to actually think about how I'm teaching things in the first place so they are not specifically associated with specific cues. So for the example I gave, the classic one is a triangle. Absolute classic one is a triangle here. We often see triangles drawn like this. So in primary, if you ask a student to draw a triangle, they would typically draw something like this, obviously with straight lines and drawn properly. The problem is sometimes we show our students that as a triangle and they will not associate that with being a triangle. So they have done research into this where the majority of people will say, this is a triangle, but they will say this is not a triangle, because when they were taught it, they were taught specifically with the idea that the triangle must look like that. And that's an example of kind of our long-term memory being associated with a specific learning cue. And that's something we need to be really mindful of when we're teaching. That's the last question I've got at the moment. So if anyone else got anything else, feel free to find me on LinkedIn and ask me a question. We do have a webinar tomorrow at the same time, all about my favorite topic in the whole of tutoring, which is questioning. So we're going to be talking about questioning. We're going to talk about specific strategies that we can do as tutors to ask better questions. It's going to be a lot more kind of practical with practical implications, because we've now got this fundamental knowledge of what we have of cognitive science. So the next few webinars are going to be about applying this knowledge to get more out. And tomorrow is going to be on questioning, which I must admit is my literally favorite ever topic to talk about. So I'm going to thank everyone for their time. It's been awesome talking to you all this evening, or talking to you as a recording. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, R4More or R4More Tutor. You'll find me. I'm more than happy to talk about tutoring. I'm going to stop the recording there. So thank you very much, everyone.